Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Cheshire with the New York State Science and Technology Law Center, and I'm pleased to introduce Melvin Crandall, Professor of Law and Director of the Technology Commercialization Law Program here at Syracuse University, Professor Shubha Ghosh.
And welcome to our monthly webinar series. Today we've got a very interesting topic and we'll have a lively discussion over the next hour. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Brian Krumm, who's able to join us from the University of Tennessee College of Law. And I guess this is sort of a homecoming for Brian because he received his BA from State University of Oswego and his MPA from Syracuse University's Maxwell School. And subsequently got his JD from the University of Tennessee College of Law and has been very active in clinical work regarding entrepreneurship and startups and the commercialization of university intellectual property, which is what he's going to talk about today. So I'll pass the baton to him and I'll have questions to follow. Thank you. Welcome, Brian.
Well, thank you, Shubha. It's really a pleasure being here and participating in this webinar. What I'd like to do today is try to give you folks some idea about what we do in the entrepreneurial law and IP clinic at the University of Tennessee, and talk about some of the types of projects we've worked on, and then focus in really on one project where we brought a small startup company from initial entity formation all the way through asset sale. It was interesting because this took 2 or 3 different semesters to go through. So I worked with law students over a long period of time, different sets of law students on that assignment. But what I'd like to do first of all is just give you some idea about what we do at the clinic at the University of Tennessee. Our primary objective is to provide a live client transactional experience for third-year law students. But we also play an important role in assisting local entrepreneurs and university researcher with developing their intellectual property and assisting them with their transactional legal needs. Some of the types of clinical services that we have are initial entity formation. Researchers, students will come to us needing to start a business entity because they want to commercialize their business, and we discuss such things as the sorts of state and local business licenses they need, federal, state, and local tax issues that might arise, any financing documentation, legal leases and commercial contracts. Operational agreements like employee agreements and user licensing agreements, and independent contractors agreements. Depending on the type of organization they have and the objectives of their organization, we'll provide broad IP counseling regarding branding, copyrights, trademarks. We do patent counseling discussing the process, and we point them to the Tech Transfer Office for more patent information. And we also have some law firms in the area that I work with that in the event that they have a patentable innovation or a potentially patentable organization, I call on them to counsel the clients. And also trade secrets, because there's not one solution to any particular intellectual property objective. Once you understand what the goals and objectives of the particular inventor might have. We also are part of the USPTO trademark program, so we actually do registrations, and we also do copyright registrations as well. We do a number of IP licensing agreements, helping the entrepreneur and researchers with licensing the intellectual property back from the university if it was indeed created while under their employment or through the use of federal or state funds. And in some instances, we draft material transfer and non-disclosure agreements where there's a need for integrity in and providing certain information to third parties.
So Brian, I know you're going to talk about this, I think, in the next slide, but just to anticipate that a little bit, could you talk a little bit more about the client base? Is it primarily from within the university, or is it in Knoxville and Tennessee more broadly?
It's in Knoxville, Tennessee, but I would say 80% is university-based. And the reason is that we've had, just by word of mouth, different researchers talk to people who've worked with us in the past. And so one of the first calls they make is to the legal clinic to see if they can help. Right. And it's interesting because it really does tie a lot of different departments in the university to the law school that we've never had a relationship with before. For example, the ag school. I've done so much work with the ag school lately that, a large proportion of the intellectual property actually comes from the ag school.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And for the non-university based inventors, or
generally come from the local business incubator.
Okay.
Both in Oak Ridge and in Knox County. It's interesting. We've got Scripps Howard has a lot of. They do a lot of production of the do-it-yourself networks and some of those programs that a lot of people watch on TV in Knoxville. And there are a number of companies that come to us that are involved with making pitches for new programs. So we're actually working with some of those companies right now.
And some of them also involve partnerships between universities and local industry,
yes.
Local business. Yeah.
Yeah. For example, we're working with one small startup right now that they're PhD students in chemical engineering, and but they're working at Oak Ridge National Labs, and they're having to license some technology from Oak Ridge National Labs to start their company. And so it's a very rich area for the sort of services we provide. And it's a great opportunity for the law students to gain hands-on, practical knowledge in applying their legal knowledge to real-world situations.
Yes, and many of the agreements you come up with, whether it's the licensing agreements or the operational agreements, have you create a standard set of forms, or do you?
Well, it's interesting because, as Professor Malloy said earlier on to me, he said, a lot of times when he was on various committees on campus, they would say, in terms of entrepreneurship, he says, well, and the law school can provide forms. Well, I call them exemplars because I don't like the idea that one form can solve any problem.
Right.
It's one of those things, there is a format that you go by, but in any transaction, the devil's in the details, and it's how well you document the agreements between the parties that will stand the test of time. While the forms or exemplars provide a framework, I make sure my students understand that it's only a framework.
Right.
And
but you don't do any actual negotiation, do you? Or is it advisory?
We advise, and it's interesting because the Tech Transfer Office at the University of Tennessee welcomes our participation because we provide a lot of counseling and information regarding the process, as well as the various provisions within the licensing agreements themselves that they don't have to waste their time with. So if educated customers come into them, it's much more efficient process for the Tech Transfer Office.
Right, wonderful. I know you have a next slide about some other clients. I wanted to provide some background for that.
Solex LLC is a company that was formed out of the School of Medicine, and the researchers found developed a radio tracer that binds with amyloid proteins, and amyloid proteins are associated with Alzheimer's disease, certain cancers, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and it allows the MRI to get a better focus in on where these amyloid proteins are aggregating. So we developed their business entity for them and material transfer agreements and non-disclosure agreements for them to deal with investors and other researchers that want to experiment with their technology to have it gain acceptability in the scientific field that they're in.
So I notice among these you've got four of them being LLCs and the other two being corporations. Is there
a reason for
more
that?
detail into that?
Well, in the process, we go through a very regimented process in explaining to the clients what the value of various types of corporations or limited liability entities there are, as well as sole proprietorships and partnerships, and we based on their particular situation, we help them make the most appropriate choice.
Okay.
It's interesting because most people come in the clinic already having their mind made up that LLC is the appropriate entity. And again, it all comes down to whether there's one of the questions we ask, and I'll deal with this in a future slide, is what's the long-term financing considerations. And if they're looking for outside funding, outside funders, whether they're venture capitalists, angels, or other kind of private equity investors, they prefer a corporate form and take preferred stock in the entity. But there's a whole range of issues that we discuss with the clients before they make that decision.
Interesting.
So, Nutraceutical Discoveries was another company that we worked with, and they basically have a product called a Nutria that they are adding to certain drinks and food stuffings that help people metabolize fat faster. And right now they've actually signed on with a pet food company to have this particular supplement in their pet foods. And I know my dogs can use it as well. But what's interesting is we actually did a venture capital transaction for Nutraceutical Discoveries. And it started getting me interested in the whole venture capital contract phenomena that I've done some research on and some scholarship on subsequently.
Yeah, hopefully we can talk about that. Was that with a Tennessee-based VC, or was it?
It was a Tennessee-based VC out of Nashville, and it was one of the first Tinvesco venture capital companies, which is basically a venture capital company that's funded by the state.
I see.
So
interesting.
490 Biotech was something out of the microbiology department, and they have and I'm going to have to read this because it's kind of complicated. They were the 2013 one of the top 10 innovations in Scientist magazine. The company develops patent-protected bioluminescent human cell lines genetically programmed to report on biological events that affect the metabolic status, which accelerates the pace of new drug discovery. Again, we focus not on the technology itself, although it helps to have a general understanding of the technology, but assisting that entity develop their business organization, as well as some non-disclosure agreements, some material transfer agreements. And since there were researchers that were involved not only in the development of this patented substance, but also some administrators that had moved into administration, we had to do a policy manual for them on what they could discuss and how they could interrelate with the university on certain issues.
Yeah. So you must get a lot of these conflict of interest or policy issues that come up with these. I mean, do you want to elaborate on those a little bit? Is it something your clinic students identify?
It's something that my students are the primary interface with all these companies. But during class and during private sessions with my students, we have to discuss things, and I have to raise issues with them, whether they had thought about certain things.
Yeah.
And they will go back to the clients and say, have you thought about some potential conflict of interest issues? And, then the client comes back and says, no, we probably need some sort of policy to make sure that we don't run afoul of university policy.
Yeah.
And how we deal with the company, and how we use the lab facilities, and how we do certain other things.
Right. And so for these companies, I think you mentioned a little bit of the incubator. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we have
a
a university business incubator on campus, and some of these companies actually take space within the incubator in order to work with university staff to and the university staff is providing secretarial administrative support, and also gives them a chance to interact with other entrepreneurs, so that there's some interchange of ideas and ways of getting their product to market. But they generally only stay within the incubator for about 2 years.
Yeah. Okay.
And in some instances,
they're still relying on university resources.
Yeah, they're still
yeah.
And sometimes there's a fee for use of the incubator space, and sometimes it's a result. They get free space depending on whether they have competed in a university-based Shark Tank competition, for lack of a better reference.
Right. Okay.
So BBB Elastomers was an interesting company because it was a super elastomer which the university and BBB was trying to commercialize. However, one of the co-inventors was a German national who passed away, and as a result, his interest in the patent went to his wife. So it was a client assignment where we actually had to get the rights. We had to clarify the rights, so we had to work with German lawyers, the University of Tennessee Research Foundation, in order to clarify that, so that we could get the intellectual property rights squared away before the BBB Elastomers could take off. And the former German researcher was part of the BBB Elastomers Corporation, or LLC. Again, I wanted to give different types of experiences, or give the audience a little bit of a different take on the experiences that we have. Floodlight Genomics is another company that we're continuing to work with. This is Kurt Lamore is a researcher, and he's a professor at the Ag School, and he's developed a methodology to have more accurate and less costly genomic testing. And he's actually licensed this technology to a company for 12 different fish and animal species currently.
Oh, wow, interesting.
Okay. Very brilliant fellow. And we work well together. Again, he's such a researcher. He has had no former business or legal exposure before, so all this is new to him. And we work very well together.
Yeah.
He has a board of advisors that I participate with on, and I really think that he will, over time, make his product Monsterplex a household name, or at least a name in the industry.
Do many of these companies, I know we're going to have an extended discussion of eye care academics in a few minutes, but do a lot of the companies, whether on this list, do they already have sort of at least their patent rights squared away before they come to your clinic, or how does that work? I mean,
what's interesting for those companies that have had a disclosure to the Tech Transfer Office. The Tech Transfer Office decides at a particular point in time whether they will spend the money to have patents issued or copyright certain things, register certain things, or they turn it over to the individual to pursue if they don't think the cost benefits are there.
Right, for the university.
Right. And then when they subsequently license the intellectual property back from the university, and I'll go over this process in subsequent frames, they incorporate those costs into the contract.
Okay. In terms of recovery.
Right.
Okay.
But yeah, Floodlight Genomics is a company that we're currently working with, and it's really exciting, the types of issues and the types of companies that want to participate with them.
Right, and so you're probably working kind of back and forth as they're working on the patents for some of these companies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting.
In this case, we associated Merchant and Gould because the process was so technical that there were only a few people that could understand what was actually going on, and we found a partner in Wisconsin, in fact, or Minnesota, one of the two. They're both cold states. That understood what he was doing, and they were looking to see if it infringed on other intellectual property, and the result was that they're going to try to keep it a trade secret as opposed to patent it.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
So, but that was beyond my pay grade to even attempt to advise on that issue. So again, we enlisted, a former law student who had to, who worked for Merchant and Gould, who then had to reach out to some of his colleagues. And then finally, iCare Academics, which will be the meat of what we're going to discuss today. It was a small startup company that we brought from initial entity formation all the way through asset sale to ensure, to give everybody an idea that it is possible to have a successful startup out of the university setting.
Great. And I should have mentioned, this is also the topic of your book, A Transactional Matter. I highly recommend it. It's a guide to business lawyering that Brian co-authored with his colleagues George Cooney and Donna Looper.
Right.
So
what I try to do is I tell the story of what happened. One of the things that I think is important for teaching law students is to provide them the context to understand how you use legal documents to accomplish your objectives. And without an understanding of that context, sometimes the legal importance of the documents are lost to them.
Yeah.
So we're not only using this book in clinic, but we're using it in a first year transactional lab, second semester, first year transactional lab, to expose law students to a transaction and helping them to understand the broad range of law that's required for assisting entrepreneurs through the process of startup companies and to protect their intellectual property.
Great.
And especially at the first year, they're having to make decisions on what courses to take after the first year, and a lot of students watch Perry Mason or other legal shows on TV, and they know what litigators do, but they don't know what transactional lawyers do.
Right.
And the reality of it is that probably 70% of the lawyers out there are transactional lawyers.
That's
so providing them with some insight into what a complex transaction looks like can help them in their career decision-making process in terms of the courses they subsequently choose and how they discuss their career opportunities with potential employers.
Right. And this is one of the success stories from the clinic as well, right? So one of the many success stories.
And it really is a good story because it was a company that was started out of a genuine need. Tammy Wyatt is an associate professor, and she may be a full professor now at the School of Nursing. And she and one of her students, Matthew Bell, were investigating purchasing a electronic health records management system for use in a clinical setting to teach their nursing students how to use electronic health records, because that was the wave of the future.
Right, right.
Okay. Well, when they started looking around, it was very costly. And they said, well, maybe we can develop a software package of our own. So they defined the functional requirements, and they went to the College of Engineering and met with Zhuping Li and one of his graduate students, and they started a partnership to start developing this system.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, and as a result of that, they started their work and came to, well, first of all, they actually went to a private attorney to start an LLC. And after about 6 months or so, they came to the our legal clinic and said that they had an LLC and that they needed some additional services, and that they were wondering if we could help.
And was this part of federally funded? This wasn't any sponsored research, was it?
It wasn't initially sponsored research. It was basically them working on a project together.
At the university.
At the university.
Connected to the university work, yeah.
However, as I'll talk about later, they did get some SBIR funding.
Okay.
And that's where...
was that for the LLC when that was formed? Yeah, okay, okay.
So let me see where we are now.
Yeah, it's great background, yeah.
Yeah, and basically the innovation is a clinical simulation tool for educating healthcare professionals in the use of electronic health records systems. And it's interesting because as part of this process, we had to do some beta testing. Again, I'll talk about this later, but the whole beta testing function was conducted at other universities. And as a byproduct, those other universities had an interest in obtaining similar systems.
I see, yeah.
So
lots of issues there, and we'll unpack them when you mentioned that.
Yeah,
in terms of human subject research.
Exactly,
So, yeah,
exactly, and that's something that we didn't.
We can talk about any of these.
Boy,
issues
that
forever.
would be a whole because I've subsequently learned a lot about that myself. Because the university has refocused. I guess there's always been a policy, but there's been more of a refocus on.
Yeah.
So
we're at the halfway. Just to interrupt, Brian. We're at the halfway point roughly, and so I forgot to remind you, if there are any questions, please text them in, and we'll have. See, there's lots of issues here, and I'm sure they're generating lots of questions. So feel free to share them with us. Sorry, Brian.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So as we talked about before, when a typical client comes in, we talk about the nature and goals of the business. Again, as you suggested, I've had more students come in or more professors come in and say, I need you to paper my company.
Yeah.
Okay. And we take a much more rigorous view of the issues that are involved in this process. And so we look at, we talk to them about how do you want to do business? You've got 4 people involved in this transaction, this business entity. How do you want to make decisions? Because that's how the operating agreement or the bylaws are formed. We talk about what are the risks and what are the potential liabilities. In some instances, a limited liability company might not be the optimal choice.
Right.
And again, we were talking, when you asked the question about LLCs or corporations, a lot of it has to do with what the financing needs are and whether there's going to be equity offered. There are some venture groups that will provide equity to a LLC, but the vast majority of them will probably want some sort of business corporation. Okay. And also providing continuity of the entity. Is this something that you want to? Is this an idea that you want to build and manage over your lifetime, or is this something you want to start and sell?
Right.
You know, most researchers want to be researchers, and they're intrigued by what the research can produce in real life, but they don't want to be managers.
Right.
They don't want to be entrepreneurs, really, to a certain extent. So we have to figure out what the appropriate structure would be for them to get the skills and human resources necessary to help them commercialize. And then finally, tax considerations. So.
Right. And so for something like this, I mean, you have different types of products that are developed. This one in the eye care is something that really, has some sort of a social benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And I can imagine. I mean, I can't speak for them obviously, but the inventors and the founders were probably really interested in having this disseminated.
Yeah.
How did that come up in the discussion? I mean, was there
there
a view that eventually it would be better if a larger company got this, or was there some pushback?
In their initial discussions, they were more focused on providing it to the university,
okay,
and then making enough money to repay them, because their initial, I'll get to this in a moment.
Yeah,
they provided the initial startup funding.
The university did. Yeah.
No, the individuals.
The individuals did themselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
and so when they were using it in the university, that would be on a license basis or royalty-free basis, or would that be on a?
Well, that came later, and let me.
Sorry,
that's okay. No. It'll be easier for the audience to understand if I bring them through the process now. They decided on a board-managed LLC after all those considerations. So we drafted the articles of organization and submitted them to the Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. Drafted the operating agreement where all four of them had, a quarter of the membership interest. And then drafted actions taken by written consent, which is basically a provision within the operating agreement which allows individuals or the members to make decisions by joint agreement to a written document, rather than having a formal meeting.
Yeah.
Which basically, help them form a bank account and take the necessary steps to work with the technology transfer office to try to try to license the technology back through the company.
Yeah. So, I mean, at this point, this wasn't sponsored research, so the university didn't really have a.
No.
Did they claim anything, or
they didn't until the.
I'm sure you're getting to this.
Yeah.
But yeah. Did they have to get clearances though from the university in order?
Well,
to do this,
because they did file they filed with the university that they were working on it. Okay. And they were using some information that they were supplying to the system.
I see.
But at that time, it was still a fuzzy.
Right.
I mean, it's not always clear whether you should disclose or you shouldn't disclose, and that's another benefit of the clinic, because we help the technology transfer office many times, basically encouraging our clients to disclose certain things that they probably should be disclosing.
Okay, really interesting.
So after we formed the entity, again, they needed to have somebody with a business background to help them actually do a lot of the work. They've got the functional requirements identified. They have some broad computer definitions, but they actually had to hire some people to do actual programming. And so they retained a chief executive officer to basically help manage and coordinate all this project.
Okay.
And they did it on a deferred basis, that he would get a large sum of money at various milestones of the process.
I see.
And it eventually worked out to be very beneficial for all parties involved.
Yeah, interesting.
But some of the things in the employment agreement that we focused on is what are the conditions for payments and bonuses? Because he wasn't being paid an hourly or a yearly salary. It was based on milestones.
Right.
So it called for a lot of creativity in the employment agreement.
Yeah, interesting.
But we also wanted to say, okay, what's the grounds for termination? There's a non-compete and non-disclosure provision in there. We also wanted to protect the IP and any trade secrets that came out, and basically that any work product that he developed would be the corporation's and not his own.
Right.
So just clarifying those sorts of issues.
Right, interesting.
Okay, this is where the unique nature of intellectual property on campus comes in. If you're working using university laboratories, facilities, materials, it can require, or it can invoke university ownership. Certainly, if you're using federal funds and state funds, the university policy is that anything that's created through the use of those funding mechanisms become part of the university's intellectual property. Now, the university has discretion to either give it back pro bono to the inventor, or to license it to the inventor.
I see.
Again, it's based on the technology transfer invention disclosure, and basically the process is that a disclosure is made, and then it goes through an evaluation process where there will be a patent agent, for lack of a better word, evaluate its patentability or its IP protectability and what potential value it might have in the marketplace.
It's typically done through the tech transfer office.
It's typically done through the tech transfer office. And if it's something that they think is valuable to the university, they will keep it and offer. If they can't find a commercial buyer for it, they will offer it back to be licensed to a company, any small company, but to the inventor primarily. And the process goes that you would draft a letter of intent, and that letter of intent would result in a process by which a license agreement, a basic license agreement, would be drafted by the technology transfer office, and once the basic agreement is signed, then they were able to do beta testing. And we also needed a sublicensing, the ability to sublicense in order to send it to the beta testing universities.
Yeah, interesting.
So. And it was interesting because some of the universities we had to deal with, there were state laws which prevented us from actually having them sign these sub-licensing agreements.
Oh, wow.
So we had to think of different mechanisms, and in one case we had to find another university
to do that.
Do that. So.
And that's just because of regulations on what
state regulations, state law regulations.
Yeah. Was this done by the clinic or these documents?
This was done by the clinic.
The letters of intent and so forth. Yeah. And did they help draft the disclosure as well, or is that
no, they didn't help draft the disclosure. It's one of those things that's we want to make sure that we differentiate legal services from business services.
Okay.
And we felt like we might misinterpret in any disclosure what the inventor's intentions were, and I don't want that liability I really try to look at the ethical and professional responsibility issues in managing the clinic very carefully.
Right.
And trying to limit risk when at all possible. Right. So that was one of the areas that I said, no, we really shouldn't be doing that because we're not experts in the field.
Right.
And it's really the inventor's job to describe what they're doing.
Right. Interesting.
So. Okay, I was talking earlier about the company's initial financing was done through loans by the participants. So we structured promissory notes from the LLC to these individuals. We actually drafted a security agreements and actually did a UCC-1 filing with the Secretary of State. So in the event that things developed and there was a purchase or dissolved and there was other creditors, there would be notice to the fact that there was priority.
Yeah. And so what was the collateral used in this?
It was basically, it was the IP, and the computers and other things that they purchased.
Inventory or the hardware, and so for the IP, so by this time, would they be with the patents had issued? Were there patents or
there wasn't any
secrets?
There were copyrights though.
Copyrights then, okay.
And there was also trademarks of the eye care name.
Okay.
Again, it's one of those things that I use this as a teaching process, and this might have been overkill, but I would want them to think about these issues, even if it was a company that had a lot of assets.
Yeah, interesting.
And it really wasn't costly. So drafting those documents and filing the UCC-1 is not a costly process.
No, it's not. But yeah, that's great.
So. Assessing long-term financing options. We have bank loans, but even in a small startup like this, bank loans would ask for personal guarantees. So bank loans, even SBA small business loans, personal guarantees would be involved. They didn't want to take on that obligation, nor did they really want to share equity. Again, it was a little too premature because we really didn't have a product on the market yet, or a marketable product. And so while there were some angel investors that were interested, they really didn't want to give up equity and they didn't want to give up control because it was primarily focused on providing a service to the university and to the students.
Right.
So there was an altruistic motive first.
So a lot of this is kind of almost like on a credit card, not exactly, because you had the promissory notes from the entity.
But no,
still,
that's about it.
Yeah, interesting.
So what we did do is try to obtain a small business innovation research grant, and I think it came from the National Institute of Health, and it was $150,000, which could be spent over a 24-month period. They could have had a follow-on grant if they needed it, but it ended up that they didn't need it. And what was interesting is it's a very valuable process to go through because, again, the focus was on developing a system, and they hadn't developed a business plan yet. But developing the SBIR proposal required them to focus on budgets and what value this intellectual property would have and what value it would have to societal impact if it was commercialized. And it forced them to create a set of business goals and a time frame in which things would be accomplished.
Yeah, yeah. How long did it take to put together the grant? I mean,
it took about a month or 2 months.
Okay, for $150,000.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And the reason being is they have principal investigators, which were Zhe Ping, and then they had to have a private person who was the CEO as the manager of the funds and the activities, and the relationships had to be clearly spelled out. And they had to have a plan on what they were going to do with the money over that period of time. And since they didn't have a business plan together, it took them time to work together to put the proposal together. And also, you have to have university support and departmental sign-offs. So there was a process for that as well.
And again, that's something that the clinic did, or is that
through the university? The clinic worked with them on the legal issues of it,
okay.
But the business planning issues, again, I try to differentiate.
Yeah. So is that something that the University of Tennessee generally has a good support mechanism for SBI
They
agreements
have the Office of Research has, and other organizations. We have an outreach function within the university that provides training in how to put these proposals together. But it's one of those things that until you've done one, it's hard to understand exactly what the details are.
Right.
It's getting into it and then asking questions about what does a good proposal look like. Because it's just like my presentation together. I have a clear view of what I'm talking about, but it's hard to communicate it to the general public.
Right.
And the real focus is it's a sales document to NIH, basically saying this is what we're going to do and this is the societal impact it'll have.
Okay, interesting.
But it really is a tremendous mechanism to get the initial funding for any university-based entity if they're trying to commercialize. And then there's a follow-on program called the STTR program that can even provide more extended funding, up to $1 million, I believe, if I recall, for certain projects.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Okay, so after we did the beta testing and we had a final product that was actually being used at our university, we started exploring, the company started exploring the idea of selling the product.
So what's the timeline here that we're
I would say
from...
after about 18 months after entity formation.
Okay, after entity formation. And then from the time of conception, when that was
probably
another 2 years or so?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So we did help them in preparing the business information. For example, we developed a website where we posted all the legal documents and all the actions taken upon written consent and how money was spent, so that potential suitors, and it wasn't open access. You had to get a special password, protected access to it, because again,
so there wasn't a specific purchaser that had been identified.
No,
yet, so this is your sort of
right. We were just exactly. We were helping them basically prepare due diligence documents.
Yeah.
And we also did, we tried to line them up with various comparables to give them some sense of what is value. And again, we did drafted non-disclosure agreements, so when they did talk to potential business suitors.
So this site, this was all done. This wasn't done at the university. Then this was an independent website, or
this was something that the CEO did.
Okay.
The CEO said, we need a site we need a format to collect all this information.
Yeah.
I can put a site together that was password protected to allow people who would sign a non-disclosure agreement to access to see what we've done and the integrity of our system. And that's another thing we counsel clients on during the whole process is, people take for granted the legal documents and the corporate formalities involved with a corporation or an LLC. And small businesses, especially that are entrepreneurial in nature, are more focused on the passion, or they have the passion for promoting the product, but not doing the administrative work to support it. And we really encourage them. We even put together a book for them so that they can print out and put in their book decisions that are made and why, so that you can have a track record for either the IRS or for a potential suitor on why you made certain decisions and how you did it, and how you spent the money. And I think it's something that, all small businesses should be counseled to do and encouraged to do, because it really does provide the underlying information necessary for another company or an investor to rely upon.
Right. Great.
So, sale of the business, basically in this instance, there were two companies that were interested in it, and they were interested in it to the effect that they sent a letter of intent. The letter of intent, one company was chosen, and they pursued the details of the letter of intent. The company then drafted an asset sales agreement, or they hired outside counsel to do that. And we participated in the markup process. And the markup process it took about 3 months, because, again, the devil's in the details, and what the original draft asset sales agreement looked like and what the business people had discussed didn't necessarily track. And even during this process, there were issues that arose that neither party had discussed, such as there was a need for ongoing consultation in the further development of the software package beyond its original framework.
Yeah.
And also, there was a need to have the inventors help market to other universities, because they were the ones that actually are using it in the class, and they wanted to help.
Interesting.
So,
You may have touched upon this. What was the decision to sell rather than license it, or to do some other? I know you had a slide previously.
No,
about
it
the
was
long
one of
term
those
versus short
things.
term, but
Yeah, it was one of those things that they had been working on it so intensively for so long
yeah,
that they were over it.
I see.
Okay, but what's also interesting is,
And this is on top of their university positions that they're doing.
exactly.
This. Okay, right? Yeah.
So, and I shouldn't say they were over it. It's just one of those things that it was a natural, that they accomplished their objective of providing a software package for use in the classroom.
Yeah.
And
it
if
sounds
they
like
could monetize it they would.
Right. It sounds like they'd made that decision at the outset.
Right,
There wasn't
right.
some.
Yeah. So there was a lot of details, and it was a trilateral agreement that had to be made, because the university licensed it, and it had certain rights that it wanted enforced too. So we had to work with the university's outside counsel. On
So the
this
university's rights were based on the copyrights.
it was it was based on the basic agreement.
on the basic agreement that they had. Okay.
Right. And one of the
The
issues,
disclosure.
and yeah, exactly.
Did that spell out in detail the intellectual property rights?
Yes.
Or in,
Yep.
even though
And it talks about
patents,
royalties. It
yeah.
talks about what happens
Right.
if you.
Now, what I meant by that is, there was no requirement that by the university that they pursue a patent.
No. No.
That they could rely upon.
And again, it was
copyrights.
software package. So, and you know more about it than I do, Shuba, but the difficulties of obtaining a.
Oh yeah. But I didn't know whether who factored that in.
Right.
Whose
Now,
decision-making that was factored into.
if they decided, the university would have probably pursued it if they thought it was
worthwhile.
If it was worthwhile.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
And then just incorporated that in any basic agreement
Yeah.
that if they sold or licensed that would be paid back.
It gets interesting in university policies because of the work made for hire rules. But it sounds like University of Tennessee has a blanket policy for all IPs.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Unlike, I think, Warp is an example where they have a much more liberal.
They tend to be,
And Texas A&M too, I believe.
Liberal in the sense that certainly in terms of what they try to let the inventors share and
Right,
things.
exactly.
Yeah. Copyright policy is a little bit more murky there, but
Okay.
but patents tend to be.
But what else is interesting is that it's a university policy that the university maintains a perpetual license for use of this at the university.
Even with the sales.
Even
the
with the
sale
sale.
was subject to that.
That's right. So all these details had to be worked out, and the students that worked on it had a wonderful opportunity not to only work with a very complex transaction, but with other
entities,
other lawyers and other
yeah,
entities.
yeah. So the university was there largely to demarcate their rights, but they weren't necessarily taking any other interest or even guiding what the
No, but it's
founders could
interesting
do.
because the outside law firm that participated in this process takes a lot of my students down.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
So,
that's always those.
yeah, it's
That's
a
the
win-win
benefit of this type of
situation.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah, then that's great. That's great. So how about the founders? Did they still have a stake, or did they retain some sort of a license?
That's an interesting because there's post-closing activities.
Yeah. Okay. Good. This is
and because just because you sell your assets, you still have to transfer those assets.
Right,
Okay.
right. Yeah.
And you have to dissolve ICARE because you don't want confusion.
Entities, yeah.
Well, you don't want confusion to the consuming public. So we had to dissolve the entity. We had to make arrangements to provide ongoing technical support, which had to be negotiated because university professors are limited to how much outside work they can do in a given semester. So we had to work those things out. And we also had to create a new business entity so that the royalty stream that was coming back from the sale, because it was both a lump sum payment and
plus royalties
over time, so that we need to create a new entity for those royalties to flow through.
Okay.
And we formed a general partnership as opposed to a limited liability company, because in Tennessee, a general partnership would allow royalties, passive investments, to come into the general partnership without franchise and excise tax being assessed to it.
Interesting. Okay.
So, I mean, we try to think
that's
through
a really interesting example of that. Yeah.
all the perturbations that can happen.
Sort of a state tax issue.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So
and so the founders then were the general partners of
right,
ATI.
exactly.
Okay.
And again, we advised them to get officers and directors insurance to provide a certain limited liability protection for them.
But so ATI largely is there to hold the royalties. Do they make any other decisions?
Well, they're also interested in other ventures too.
Okay. So. Interesting. And so are they providing the technical support through ATI, or is that independent? Okay.
Yep.
And so that's not done on is that done compensated as well, or is it?
No, there's actually a consulting portion or an exhibit that's consulting agreement attached to the asset sales agreement.
I see.
So, but I can entertain any questions that you have.
Yeah, are there any questions from Jess? No. Yeah, there are a lot of people listening, I know, but I think we covered a lot of ground. I think one of the things that this example shows is the different interactions, a success story about how university-based startup can be successful.
Absolutely.
I guess we could always wonder, do you think if there had been sponsored research, the situation would have been different? Let's say they came up with this under the invention under a grant from the
again,
from
I think that depends on the character of the technology transfer office.
Yeah.
And I conceptually, I look at them, how they're managed throughout the United States, whether they're a cost center or a profit center.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, some of it's my understanding, like MIT's technology transfer office is just, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a profit center, but it's very, very profitable.
Right.
And I think it has a lot to do with the nature of the scientific research they do, and
the university's kind of perception of what commercialize and the benefits of that. Yeah. Because as many of our listeners know, the TTO is an obligation for universities that have sponsored research to set up these, and so a lot of universities are not completely clear what to do with them. Right? And that's kind of a nice characterization, whether they're viewed as something for generation of revenue or just an obligation under the Bayh-Dole Act.
And it's interesting because we have a very cooperative technology transfer office at the University of Tennessee, and they work very closely with some of these small businesses.
Yeah. And I think University of Tennessee is also a unique position because it's always been Tennessee as a state has always been a recipient of federal funds.
Yeah.
Great Depression and even
Exactly.
before, and then trying to
And Oak Ridge National
commercialize all
Labs.
that. Right. So
It's a really exciting time in our area, and entrepreneurism is really a major focus now.
yeah,
It's I think a state economic development objective to grow more companies in Tennessee than try to use tax incentives to attract
businesses to come there. Yeah.
So
And what was the company that bought it? Was it a Tennessee company that?
no, it was actually a Chicago. Well, I think it was a Delaware company.
Yeah, no, I mean that was
located in
incorporated,
Chicago.
yeah, where they're doing
Yeah,
business. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
But it's interesting because, I mean, I like the small companies that can grow and stay in Tennessee.
right.
But, that wasn't their particular long-term objective. So
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Lots of things to talk about. I think. Do you have any? We're sort of at the end of the hour, but do you have any sort of take-home messages that you'd like to leave us with about what makes for a good success story?
I think initially, passion of the entrepreneur coupled with aligning themselves with a group of advisors and lawyers to help them structure their activities in a very clear and focused manner.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, and
sort of a close, a well-defined product.
Right,
Here,
right.
It could be.
right. But it's really the passion of the entrepreneur and the value it has to the marketplace.
Okay,
So,
great. Well, thanks so much,
thank
Brian.
you, Shuba. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Good discussion. For those who want to learn more, this will be webcast in a couple of weeks, and I do recommend a guide, Transactional Matter by Brian, that really lays out a lot of these issues and goes into this case study in more detail. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Shuba. I appreciate it.
And look out for information for our next webinar, probably sometime in April.
Thank you.